For today's video, I'm going to be doing a deep dive on filterless shrimp tanks, which are becoming increasingly popular in the hobby. I currently have a Walstad shrimp tank, a Pearlweed jungle tank, an orange neocaridina tank and a Walstad shrimp jar that can all run without filters. Two of them do currently have a small hang and back filter on them for mechanical filtration, but more on that at the end of the video as it is optional. The concept of filterless shrimp tanks is pretty simple. You set the tank up, add your plants, let it mature and then add your shrimp. This can be a no-tech setup because I do know some people who place the tank on a window and use the sun for their light source. The light helps plants, algae and biofilm grow, which your shrimp will feed on, and then the shrimp waste and the substrate provide nutrients for the plant, keeping the water safe, creating a self-sustaining cycle in the aquarium. Diana Walstad published a very popular book on this type of tank called The Ecology of the Planted Aquarium, and I highly recommend you read it if you're interested in this type of setup. One of the main advantages of this type of shrimp tank is that it's highly customizable, allowing you to tailor it to your exact needs. I want to go over the key aspects that you can personalize, starting with the substrate. There's three main substrate options, which are dirt capped with sand or gravel, Aquasoil and Inert Substrate. All of my current filterless shrimp tanks use dirt capped with sand or gravel as it's cheap and works well, but the specific ratio of dirt to cap and layer that you use has its own unique pros and cons. A thinner cap boosts the dissolved oxygen flow to plant roots but does risk exposing the dirt and potentially harmful toxins. An equal depth of soil and cap and layer balances oxygen penetration and safety for your shrimp. And a thicker cap and layer may limit oxygen penetration to your plant roots, but it does drastically reduce the nutrient and toxin leak risk in the tank. In my opinion, your cap and layer should be equal to or deeper than your dirt layer, but different people do have different preferences. I've had no noticeable issues with root rot in my tanks with deeper cap and layers, and this setup helps to reduce nutrient leaks, keeping things safer for your shrimp while also reducing the risk of algae blooms and cloudy water. The pricier Aquasoil options like ADA Amazonia are pre-soaked in ammonia to boost their nutrient profile for plants, but this means it can release ammonia into the water column for a longer period of time, potentially putting your shrimp at risk. I prefer fluval stratum because it's cheap, it doesn't leak much ammonia and it provides enough nutrients for a low-tech shrimp tank like these when used correctly. Aquasoils can lower the pH in shrimp tanks, which may cause issues with some species of shrimp. In my experience, the buffering period is far shorter than the manufacturers claim, and neocaridina shrimp can live on them during the buffering period with minimal issues. Inert substrates like Carib Sea Eco Complete were once popular for shrimp tanks, but black diamond blasting sand has become more common in North America. Here in Europe, Unipack Micro Gravel is a similar option, though some people do just use regular sand. These inert substrates are usually the cheapest option for your shrimp tank, and it doesn't affect your pH or release toxins or excess nutrients into the water. The downside is that the lack of nutrients can be an issue for a lot of plants, so a lot of people who use an inert substrate will choose to use a lot of floating plants to maintain safe and stable water parameters as they absorb their nutrients directly from the water column. All three substrates can work if you design your shrimp tank around it, and I have setup videos for my Walstad shrimp tank, my Pearlweed jungle tank and my Walstad shrimp jar, which I'll link in the video description. If you are a beginner, I'd recommend that you go with the dirt capped with sand or fine gravel, and that you try and keep your cap and layer at least the same depth as your dirt layer. So moving on to lighting, and I've seen people use everything from sunlight through their windows to desktop lamps to cheap LED aquarium lights to USB clip-on lights, and they can all work in the right situation. As I mentioned earlier, lighting is crucial for this type of shrimp tank since it's the key component for healthy plant growth, which keeps your shrimp safe by acting as a natural filter for the tank. Now, I'm not a fan of the direct sunlight method as it can lead to excess algae growth due to too much light getting to the tank. In my area, desktop lamps cost about the same as a cheap Ciora LED light that's perfect for shrimp tanks, and a Haiger USB clip-on light can work well for shrimp jars, with these coming with built-in timers and adjustable light settings. Just find a lighting solution that suits your needs and make sure you provide your shrimp jar with between 6 and 8 hours of light per day. This should be enough to promote healthy plant growth while letting biofilm grow in the tank that your shrimp will eat, while also minimizing algae growth. So moving on to heaters, and all of my shrimp tanks and shrimp jars are kept at room temperature without an internal heater. This removes the initial cost of buying a heater as well as the ongoing cost of the electricity used to power it. Thankfully, Neocaridina shrimp should be completely fine at room temperature during the winter, so it really doesn't matter too much with this type of shrimp tank. The cherry and Amano shrimp in my first shrimp jar last year made it through the winter without issue, and I'm confident that all of my current setups will do the same this year. If you do want peace of mind, then you can buy a cheap heater if you like, but most people I know who keep Neocaridina, be it in a filtered or filterless shrimp tank, keep them at room temperature without an internal heater. So moving on to Hardscape, and you can add driftwood, rocks or decorations like ceramic hiding tubes for the shrimp to go in after their molds, but in all honesty none of these are essential. Some driftwood can lower your tank's pH levels, while certain rocks can increase it, so it is important to do the research on any hardscape you plan to use in your setup. People say that lava rock increases surface area for beneficial bacteria colonies, which can help keep your shrimp tank's water safe. Now this is true, but without a lot of water flow in the tank, the actual benefit of this additional surface area may be limited. I've noticed that the shrimp in my Walstad shrimp jar are constantly grazing on the algae and biofilm that grow on the lava rock in there, so it does serve as an excellent grazing area and could be used just for that. Like I said though, Hardscape is totally optional for this type of setup, so you don't need to use any of it if you don't want to. So moving on to tank size, and I'm currently using 6.6 US gallon or 25 litre tanks and 1.7 US gallon or 6.6 litre jars for my setups. I've seen people use far smaller jars than this without issue, but keep in mind that the smaller the jar, the harder it can be to add proper lighting to keep your plants healthy and the plants are acting like your filter. In theory, as long as you have enough plants to handle the shrimp's bioload, there's no upper limit on this type of shrimp tank setup either. Larger water volumes do tend to have more stable water parameters, making it easier to maintain a safe environment for your shrimp. That's why I would usually recommend that someone new to this type of tank setup uses the largest tank they have available, with something around 10 US gallons being ideal for a beginner. Moving on to plants, as fast grown plants are essential for this type of tank setup in my opinion. Stem plants like Rotala rotundifolia, Hygrophila polysperma, Limnophilia sessiliflora and Pearlweed are all great for processing nitrogen compounds quickly and helping your shrimp stay safe. While these plants can technically float, they don't penetrate the surface well enough to take advantage of the CO2 in the air, so I personally prefer to use them in the substrate for better access to micronutrients in the soil. People often claim that stem plants only feed from the water column, which may lead to a nutrient buildup in the substrate with this type of tank, but I've not seen any research to actually support this. In fact, while I was searching for research on this topic, I came across this research paper linked in the description that tested water wort in submerged pots with different substrates that were all capped with sand at a 1:1 ratio. The study found significant increases in plant biomass, total length, leaf count and runners in the plants that were grown in a substrate that was high in nitrogen. This does suggest that stem plants can feed from the substrate without any problems, making them suitable for this type of tank, and I've used them extensively in the majority of my setups. The shorter Vallisneria asiatica and dwarf Sagittaria are both stolon plants that are very effective at natural water purification for this type of shrimp tank too, but I haven't used either of them in any of my tanks yet, but it is on my to-do list. True floating plants like Salvinia, water lettuce, redroot floaters and duckweed are also excellent choices, as they can use the CO2 in the air to grow quickly, removing toxins from your water column. You can use most other plants available in the hobby as secondary decorative options in your tank, with moss being a particularly good option because shrimp enjoy grazing on the algae and biofilm that grow on it. I'll include a link to FlowGrow's database in the video description so you can check the temperature tolerance ranges for the plants you are thinking of using in your tank against the expected lower temperatures in your area to make sure they'll survive. Keep in mind that plant growth will slow during the colder months in an unheated tank, but your shrimp's metabolism will also decrease, so feeding less should help maintain safe and stable water parameters, so keep that in mind. Moving on to feeding the tank, and some people let their shrimp feed on the algae and biofilm that naturally grow in this type of shrimp tank without adding any other food. I do see people say that their natural diet is algae and biofilm, but shrimp are scavengers, so they will feed on dead things that they find in their natural habitat, so that's why I like to add high protein food sources. I prefer feeding my shrimp tanks regularly because I do enjoy watching them eat, and I've noticed they have far higher breeding yields when they have protein in their diet. Fluval bug bites, Hikari mini algae wafers and bloodworm are all great protein rich options that my shrimp absolutely love to eat. I usually feed one fluval bug bite or a quarter of a mini algae wafer per 10 adult shrimp in the tank each day, with bloodworm being more of a weekly treat rather than a staple in their diet. One downside of this type of shrimp tank is that shrimp have a low bioload, so until your shrimp colony grows large enough to feed them more food, you may need to supplement your tank with liquid fertilizers to support your plants. I usually add a couple of drops of an all-in-one liquid fertilizer once per week, which seems to work fine, but once your shrimp colony is big enough, you can usually just let your shrimp food and their waste fertilize the plants. Moving on to water parameters, and maintaining stable conditions in this type of shrimp tank is surprisingly easy. If you're using a capped dirt substrate, then the tank can cycle over a 4 to 6 week period from the ammonia that will naturally be released through the capping layer from the soil. I've done this a couple of times myself, but moving forward I do plan to use Dr. Tim's ammonia solution or a different ammonia product to simulate a bioload in the tanks, as it's easier to accurately dose them, making sure that the shrimp are safe once added to the tank. So far I've been dosing my new shrimp tanks to 1 ppm of ammonia, following the instructions on the label, and then letting them cycle over a 4 to 6 week period. I like to wait until the tank is able to process a dosing of 1 ppm ammonia down to 0 ppm ammonia and 0 ppm nitrite within 24 hours, and then I'll continue dosing the tank for an extra week or two before adding shrimp. I've decided to add that extra week or two of dosing because there is a detection gap between 0 ppm and 0.25 ppm on most test kits, which could still mean there's harmful ammonia and nitrite in the tank during that period. In my experience, once these tanks are cycled, the ammonia, nitrite and nitrate levels are all stable unless you make a mistake. The plants, bacteria and archaea manage the ammonia and nitrite effectively, and a small monthly water change of between 10 and 20% should be enough to keep nitrate levels below 20 ppm, but in all honesty that is not essential every month. I did recently have a scare in my red cherry shrimp tank after adding 2 new Medaka rice fish to the setup. For some reason I just stuck to my usual routine and overlooked the fact that I was feeding the Medaka, which essentially doubled or even trebled the amount of food that I was adding to that tank per day, which caused an ammonia spike. Thankfully I noticed the water was starting to cloud and checked the water parameters, noticed the increase and did a huge water change to stop the situation getting any worse, and thankfully it hasn't happened since. Just keep things like this in mind if you do add fish, shrimp or snails to the tank, because it's easy to stick to your old habits and current routine with the tank and overlook simple but important changes that could lead to disaster. pH, GH, KH and TDS are all a little trickier because they can depend on your current water source. I have soft tap water, so I choose to add some type of shrimp salt to increase the GH and KH during water top-ups and water changes. It doesn't have to be this brand, there's plenty of them out there. I aim for a GH of between 6 and 10 to ensure my Neocaridina shrimp can mould correctly without issue, but I don't personally track my pH, KH or TDS anymore in this type of tank. Even then, I do know a large number of people who don't even check their GH anymore, and provided they're not having issues with their shrimp molting, they'll just add the shrimp salt and crack on and let their shrimp do their thing. If you have hard tap water, then you probably won't need to add the shrimp salt, as the mineral content directly out of your tap should be sufficient for your shrimp to molt. Depending on your area, you should be able to just Google if you have hard or soft water and get the results quickly. One of the key things to remember when setting up a filterless shrimp tank is patience. Allowing the tank to mature properly is essential to establish a stable ecosystem, so I recommend waiting between 4 and 6 weeks after the initial setup before introducing any shrimp. This should give the bacteria and archaea colonies enough time to develop, while also letting the plants establish themselves so they can use up the nitrogen compounds in the water efficiently. It should also let some biofilm and microalgae form in the tank, so there's some food in there when you get to add your shrimp to the tank. So moving on to suitable shrimp species for this type of tank, and personally I've only kept Neocaridina shrimp and Armano shrimp in a filterless setup. I recommend starting with red cherry shrimp because they're the most common type of Neocaridina shrimp in the hobby. They are also cheap, easy to find in stores, they're very colourful, and in my experience they're generally hardier than some of the other colours in the hobby. Cherry shrimp usually breed true as well, meaning that their offspring will usually also be red. This allows you to just let your colony grow out naturally without needing to remove any randomly coloured shrimp in there to maintain the colour of the colony. If red's not your thing, then Neocaridina shrimp come in a wide variety of colours, so I'm sure that you can find one that catches your eye. As mentioned earlier, Neocaridina can thrive in room temperature tanks year round in most households, eliminating the need for a heater, reducing costs too. Neocaridina shrimp are also very low maintenance and will happily feed on the algae, biofilm and detritus in their tank without you needing to frequently feed them if you live a busy life. So yeah, if you are looking for your first tank, I definitely recommend you go with red cherry shrimp. Moving on to breeding, and Neocaridina shrimp are incredibly easy to breed. As long as you have both males and females in the tank, you can expect baby shrimp in the future. In my experience, breeding does tend to slow down or even stop during the colder months of the year, but my established colonies have been expanding rapidly over the recent summer months here in the UK. It is worth noting that female Neocaridina shrimp are typically more colourful than the males, so it can be common to end up with a colony full of female shrimp that can't breed. I recently had this issue with my orange Neocaridina tank, where I noticed all the shrimp had eggs developing in their ovaries, confirming they were all female. I chose to add another 10 orange Neocaridina shrimp to the tank in the hopes of introducing a male, and now there's at least 2 females in there carrying eggs, so it does seem to have worked and they are currently breeding. To avoid this in your own tank, I recommend starting with between 10 and 20 shrimp if possible. This increases the chances of having at least one male in the tank, and also accounts for any shrimp that may not survive the transition to your tank due to change in water parameters. In reality though, you can start a colony in this type of shrimp tank with one male shrimp and one female shrimp. As I mentioned in the feeding section, I found that Neocaridina shrimp have higher breeding yields when I target feed them with high protein food, so keep that in mind if you are aiming to grow a large colony of shrimp. Maintaining optimal water parameters is also important when aiming for a large colony of shrimp, as baby shrimp moult far frequently than the adults due to their faster growth rates. Remember that a GH level of between 6 and 10 is optimal and should increase the survival rate of your young shrimp in the tank by ensuring that they can moult easily, but they can moult outside of this range, just survival rates will be lower. Moving on to tank maintenance, and these setups can be very low maintenance when set up correctly. I'm currently recording the daily events in my Walstad shrimp tank for a Cherry Shrimp Diaries video next month, but in all honesty it's turning out to be pretty uneventful. Most of the daily clips just involve me adding food to the tank, as there's surprisingly little upkeep required for the tank. With the colder months approaching, water top-ups are becoming less frequent as there's less water evaporating each day. My Rotala rotundifolia only needs trimming once or twice a month, and it is getting close to the length that I'd usually cut it, but if you choose to, you can let it grow out far longer than this. This cherry shrimp colony is also large enough to quickly consume any food that I add to it, so I don't even need to worry about removing uneaten food in the tank. Essentially, I just let the tank run itself and do minimal interactions with it. I add some food each day, top up the water when needed, trim the plants once a month and do a 10 to 20% partial water change if needed, but that's not essential. Frequent water changes are not usually necessary once this type of shrimp tank is mature, and I often skip water changes if there's no obvious problems with the tank. In fact, doing too many water changes can disrupt the delicate balance between beneficial bacteria, archaea and biofilm, and it can also cause rapid shifts in water parameters which shrimp don't like. Looking at my Pearlweed jungle tank with my Bloody Mary Neocaridina shrimp, and I don't even bother to trim the plants anymore, I just let them grow out freely to get the jungle look, reducing maintenance even further. This is one of the reasons I think shrimp tanks are so underrated in the hobby. The shrimp's low bioload minimises the risk of issues that are more common in fish tanks, making these as low maintenance as possible and great for people who have busy lives. Although this video is focused on setting up a filterless shrimp tank, I do want to briefly touch on why adding a filter may be a good idea. Firstly, a filter provides an extra layer of protection for your shrimp, helping to minimise any potential water parameter spikes that could be harmful. I'm not saying that a filter would have prevented the recent ammonia spike issue I had in my cherry shrimp tank, but it might have helped minimise the effects. The main reason I added a small hang-on back filter to 2 of my tanks was for mechanical filtration to remove particulate matter from the water. Foods like mulberry leaves and snowflake shrimp food tend to release a lot of particles into the water which become annoying, and I do use both foods frequently with my shrimp. I wanted a way to remove them from the tank without resorting to frequent large water changes, and small filters with some filter floss in it seem to be the best option. Filters also improve water flow in the tank, and research does suggest that this helps to distribute nutrients around the tank, promoting healthier, better plant growth. These small hang-on back filters are great, but they can pose a crush risk to baby shrimp if they get inside the filter because of the impeller. A cheap sponge filter with an air pump is definitely a better option for a max yield breeding setup, as it has minimal risk to baby shrimp. So filterless shrimp tanks can work well, and in my opinion they're also beginner friendly, but adding a small, cheap hang-on back filter or sponge filter can make things even easier, especially if this is your first setup. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for watching and have a good day.